"She doesn't belong here," my daughter-in-law said at dinner while pointing directly at me across the table, and my own son lowered his eyes like he was too ashamed to stop her. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply folded my napkin beside my untouched plate and realized, in that quiet moment, that the family I had spent 40 years protecting had already decided I was no longer part of it. I'm Evelyn Carter. I'm 70 years old, and until that night, I still believed loyalty meant something inside a family. The dining room smelled like rosemary chicken and fresh dinner rolls, the same Sunday meal I used to make every week when Michael was a little boy with grass stains on his sneakers and freckles across his nose. Back then, he used to run into the kitchen asking if he could steal a roll before dinner. Now he sat at the head of the table beside his wife Sabrina, staring down at his wine glass, while she humiliated me in front of everyone. The chandelier above us cast a warm golden light across the room, but nothing about that evening felt warm anymore. Sabrina leaned back in her chair with the kind of smile women wear when they already know they've won. Her blonde hair was perfectly curled, her diamond bracelet sparkling every time she lifted her wine glass. She looked beautiful in the way magazine covers look beautiful. Polished. Untouchable. Cold. "Mom," Michael finally muttered under his breath, though he wasn't talking to me. He was talking to her, asking her quietly not to make a scene. But the truth was, the scene had already happened the second she pointed at me like I was a stranger who wandered into the wrong house. Chloe, my 14-year-old granddaughter, sat frozen beside me, clutching her fork so tightly her knuckles turned pale. She looked from Sabrina to Michael and then back to me with wide, uncertain eyes. Poor child. She still believed adults always knew what they were doing. "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking," Sabrina continued with a shrug before taking another sip of wine. "This house is crowded enough already." Crowded. The words settled into my chest heavier than I expected. This was the same house my late husband Richard and I bought 32 years ago after saving every extra dollar we had. I still remembered standing in the empty living room with him on move-in day eating takeout pizza off paper plates because we couldn't afford furniture yet. Richard painted every wall in this house himself. He built the bookshelves in Michael's childhood bedroom with his own hands. Every corner held memories of our life together. But after Richard passed away 2 years earlier, something slowly shifted inside this family. At first it was small things. Sabrina reorganizing the kitchen without asking me. Michael forgetting our Sunday breakfasts. Family photos disappearing from the hallway walls one by one. I noticed all of it. I just never wanted to believe what it meant. "Maybe Mom would be happier somewhere quieter," Sabrina said lightly, while cutting into her chicken parmesan. "Someplace with people her own age." There it was. Not concern. Not kindness. Removal. Michael finally looked up then, but only briefly. His eyes met mine for half a second before drifting away again. That hurt more than Sabrina's words ever could. Because silence can wound you in ways shouting never will. I glanced toward Richard's empty chair at the end of the table. Even after 2 years, part of me still expected to see him sitting there with his reading glasses slipping down his nose, ready to change the subject before things got ugly. Richard always protected me. But dead men can't defend their wives. Sabrina dabbed her lips with her napkin and smiled at me politely, as if she had just suggested a restaurant instead of erasing me from my own family. "No offense, Evelyn," she added sweetly. "I just think everyone would feel more comfortable." Comfortable. I nodded slowly and placed my napkin on the table beside my plate. My appetite had vanished somewhere between her first sentence and Michael's silence. Nobody stopped me when I stood up. Nobody asked me to stay. The only sound in the room was the soft clink of silverware against china as I walked toward the staircase. Halfway up the stairs, I heard Sabrina laugh quietly downstairs, followed by the low murmur of Michael's voice. Then Chloe's chair scraped suddenly against the hardwood floor. "Grandma," she called softly behind me, her voice trembling just enough to crack my heart open. I turned and forced a small smile onto my face. "It's all right, sweetheart," I told her gently. But the truth was, nothing felt all right anymore. Because for the first time in my life, I finally understood something terrifying. Families don't always break apart loudly. Sometimes they do it quietly, one dinner at a time. I stayed inside my room for almost an hour after dinner, sitting quietly at the edge of the bed while the sounds of laughter drifted faintly upstairs through the heating vents. The same people who had watched me get humiliated downstairs were now finishing dessert like nothing had happened. I stared at the family photo resting on my nightstand. Richard had taken it 12 years earlier during a summer trip to Cape Cod. Michael stood behind me with his hands on my shoulders back then, smiling like he was proud to be my son. Chloe was still a little girl with missing front teeth, hugging my arm tightly while wine tangled her blonde hair across her face. Sabrina stood beside Michael wearing a white sundress and oversized sunglasses. Even in the photograph, her smile looked practiced, careful, controlled. I picked up the frame slowly and noticed dust gathering along the edges. That alone told me how much had changed in this house. I used to dust every room myself every Saturday morning while old jazz records played softly in the kitchen. Richard would make coffee while pretending to complain that I was cleaning too much. We had routines, small rituals, the kind that quietly become a marriage after 40 years together. Now the house felt like a hotel lobby where nobody planned on staying long enough to care about the details. Around 10 o'clock, I finally opened my bedroom door. The upstairs hallway was dark except for the small nightlight glowing near Chloe's room. I could hear the dishwasher humming downstairs. Sabrina always ran it at night because she hated waking up to dirty dishes. Funny how someone could care so much about spotless countertops while making people feel disposable. I walked slowly toward the staircase and stopped halfway down when I heard their voices from the kitchen. "She cannot stay here forever, Michael," Sabrina whispered sharply. "We talked about this." "Keep your voice down," Michael answered tiredly. "Chloe is upstairs." "I do not care if Chloe hears." A cabinet door shut harder than necessary. "Your mother makes everyone uncomfortable. Every room feels tense when she is around." There was a long silence after that. I waited for my son to defend me. I waited for him to remind his wife that this had been my home long before it was hers. Instead, I heard the sound of ice clinking against glass. "Maybe she would be happier somewhere smaller," Michael said quietly. Smaller. Such a harmless word on the surface. But I knew what he meant. Smaller life. Smaller presence. Smaller existence. I stepped back before they could hear me standing there and returned upstairs carefully, one hand gripping the banister tighter than usual. My chest felt hollow in a way I could not explain. Not dramatic pain. Not anger. Just emptiness. Like someone had slowly been removing pieces of my life while I was too distracted by grief to notice. Back inside my room, I opened the closet and looked at Richard's old wool coat, still hanging exactly where he left it 2 winters ago. I ran my fingers across the sleeve gently. He always smelled faintly of cedarwood and coffee. Sometimes I still imagined hearing his truck pulling into the driveway after work. Grief does strange things to the mind. It keeps old doors open long after the house has changed. I sat down at my vanity and began removing my earrings carefully, placing them inside the small ceramic dish Richard bought me during our anniversary trip to Santa Fe years ago. Beneath the dish sat a folded bank statement I had almost forgotten about. Earlier that week, I noticed money missing from one of the household accounts Richard and I used to share. Not much, just enough to bother me. When I asked Michael about it, he brushed it off quickly and said Sabrina had moved funds around for renovation estimates. Renovations. Another word that suddenly sounded different now. I opened the drawer beside the vanity where I kept our important documents, birth certificates, insurance papers, old tax returns. The folder containing the property records was gone. I froze immediately. I searched again more carefully, moving envelopes aside, checking beneath old recipe books and folders I had not touched in months. Nothing. My heartbeat slowed instead of speeding up. That was the strange part. Fear did not arrive loudly anymore. It arrived quietly, calmly, like a truth finally stepping into the light after hiding in the corners for too long. Then I noticed something else. My spare house key was missing from the drawer too. I sat there staring into the empty space where it used to be while the grandfather clock downstairs chimed 11 times through the silent house. Somewhere below me, Sabrina laughed softly at something on television. And for the first time since Richard died, I began to wonder if losing my husband had not been the worst thing that happened to me after all. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise the way I always had during my years with Richard. Some habits survive grief because the body remembers routines even after the heart no longer understands why. Pale blue light filtered through the bedroom curtains while the old radiator clicked softly against the cold November air. For a few seconds, lying there beneath the quilt Richard's mother made for us decades ago, I almost forgot everything that had happened downstairs the night before. Then I heard footsteps in the hallway, followed by Sabrina's voice drifting through the walls, sharp and impatient even that early in the morning. Reality returned all at once. I dressed slowly in a cream-colored sweater and dark slacks before heading downstairs. The kitchen smelled faintly of cinnamon coffee creamer and toasted bread. Sabrina stood at the counter scrolling through her phone while Michael poured coffee into a travel mug. Neither of them noticed me at first. Chloe sat quietly at the table doing homework with earbuds dangling around her neck. She looked relieved when she saw me enter the room. "Morning, Grandma," she said softly. "Good morning, sweetheart." I kissed the top of her head and reached for the coffee pot, but Sabrina moved it slightly closer to herself before I could grab it. Such a small motion, most people would never notice. But cruelty inside families rarely begins with dramatic moments. It begins with inches. "There is only enough left for Michael," she said casually without looking up from her phone. "You can make another pot if you want." Michael froze for half a second with his mug in hand. He could have said something then. Anything. Instead, he pretended not to notice. "I am running late," he muttered while grabbing his car keys from the counter. He kissed Sabrina on the cheek before heading toward the garage. He did not look at me when he left. The back door closed. Silence settled over the kitchen again. I opened another bag of coffee grounds and quietly started a fresh pot, while Sabrina continued typing messages with long polished nails tapping against her phone screen. "By the way," she said after a moment, "the realtor is stopping by Thursday afternoon." My hands paused over the coffee filter. "Realtor?" Sabrina finally glanced at me then, her expression perfectly calm. "For the guest house renovation idea." Guest house? We did not have a guest house. We had a detached studio Richard built 15 years ago because he wanted a quiet place to paint during retirement. He loved that little building more than any room in the house. I remembered bringing him sandwiches out there during summer afternoons while old Frank Sinatra songs played from the dusty radio he kept near the window. "Michael said he mentioned it to you," Sabrina added lightly. "He had not." Chloe slowly removed one earbud and looked between us nervously. "Grandpa loved the studio," she said carefully. Sabrina smiled without warmth. "Well, Grandpa is not here anymore." The words landed hard in the room. Chloe lowered her eyes immediately. I poured my coffee slowly and sat across from my granddaughter without responding. Sabrina hated silence because silence forced her to sit alone with the ugliness of her own words. Sure enough, within seconds, she stood abruptly and grabbed her designer purse from the counter. "I have Pilates in 20 minutes, she announced before leaving the kitchen in a cloud of expensive perfume and impatience. The moment the front door shut behind her, Chloe looked at me with tears gathering in her eyes. "Grandma, I am sorry," she whispered. "You do not need to apologize for grown people behaving badly," I told her gently. She stared down at her math worksheet for a long moment before speaking again. "Mom says you might move soon." There it was again. Move. Leave. Relocate. Every conversation now carried the same hidden message underneath it. I wrapped both hands around my coffee mug and forced myself to remain calm. "Did your father say that too?" Chloe hesitated. "Last week I heard them talking after they thought I was asleep." Her voice dropped even lower. "Mom said if you left the house would finally feel like theirs." The kitchen suddenly felt colder despite the steam rising from my coffee. I looked toward the hallway where family photographs once hung before Sabrina redecorated everything in gray and white tones that looked more like a hotel than a home. Richard used to say houses absorb the personalities of the people living inside them. If that was true, this house had become unrecognizable. Chloe reached across the table and squeezed my hand gently. Such a small gesture. Yet somehow it kept me from completely falling apart. Then I noticed something sitting near the fruit bowl on the counter. A folder. Thin blue paper sticking halfway out. I recognized Richard's handwriting immediately across the tab label. Property trust documents. Sabrina must have pulled it from somewhere while organizing papers. Or hiding them. Either way, my heartbeat slowed into something steady and focused. Because suddenly, for the first time in weeks, I realized there were still things inside this house that belonged to me. After Chloe left for school, I stayed alone in the kitchen staring at the blue folder beside the fruit bowl while the coffee in my mug slowly turned cold. Morning sunlight spilled through the windows above the sink, illuminating tiny dust particles drifting through the air like they had nowhere else to go. The house felt unusually quiet without Michael rushing between rooms or Sabrina talking loudly on speakerphone with her friends. For the first time in weeks, I could hear the old grandfather clock ticking from the living room again. Richard always said silence reveals things noise tries to hide. I reached for the folder carefully, almost expecting someone to stop me. Inside were property documents, tax records, and handwritten notes in Richard's unmistakable block lettering. He had always written slowly and neatly, like every word mattered. My fingers paused on one folded sheet near the bottom. Across the top, Richard had written in black ink, "In case Evelyn ever needs this." My chest tightened instantly. I carried the paper upstairs to our old bedroom before unfolding it completely beside the window where Richard used to sit reading newspapers every Sunday morning. The note was dated 6 months before his death. I remembered that period well. He had already started growing weaker by then, though he tried hard not to let anyone notice. Even during chemotherapy, he insisted on mowing the lawn himself because he said paying someone else to do it made him feel old. The memory made me smile for exactly 1 second before the ache returned. I began reading slowly. "Evelyn, if you are reading this, it means something in this house no longer feels right. I know you. You will ignore problems to keep peace inside the family. But peace without respect is only quiet unhappiness." I stopped breathing for a moment. It felt like Richard was sitting beside me again, saying the exact words I had refused to admit to myself for 2 years. The letter continued. "I love our son, but love does not always make people strong. Sometimes it makes them weak in the wrong places, especially when someone else is doing the thinking for them." I closed my eyes briefly. Even near the end of his life, Richard had seen things more clearly than I did. There had been moments when he questioned Sabrina gently, though never cruelly. Small comments after family dinners. Little observations while driving home from holidays. "She likes control too much," he once told me quietly after Thanksgiving. At the time, I defended her immediately because I thought that was what good mothers did. They protected the family from conflict. Now I wondered how many truths I had buried under politeness. I continued reading. The studio documents, the trust papers, and the property agreements were updated after my diagnosis. Martin Reeves has copies of everything. "If anyone ever pressures you, threatens your place in this home, or attempts to manipulate you financially, do not handle it alone. Promise me that." Tears blurred the page for the first time since Richard's funeral. Not dramatic sobbing, just silent tears slipping down my face while the house remained completely still around me. I pressed the paper carefully against my chest and looked toward Richard's empty side of the bed. The indentation in the mattress had long disappeared, but sometimes I still imagined seeing him there adjusting his glasses before bed while complaining about the evening news. Grief changes shape over time. At first it crushes you all at once. Later it arrives quietly through ordinary things. Empty chairs, forgotten jackets, notes written by hands that no longer exist. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. Chloe stepped into the room, still wearing her backpack. "I forgot my history binder," she explained before noticing the tears on my face. "Grandma." I quickly wiped beneath my eyes and smiled gently. "I am all right, sweetheart." She walked closer slowly. "Mom made Dad move all Grandpa's old painting supplies out of the studio this morning," she whispered. "She said the space needs to look modern before the realtor comes." Something cold settled deep inside me then. Not panic, not sadness, clarity. I looked back down at Richard's letter resting in my hands. "Peace without respect is only quiet unhappiness." For 2 years I had mistaken silence for patience. I had mistaken avoidance for kindness. But sitting there in the bedroom Richard and I once shared, I finally understood what my husband had been trying to leave behind for me. Not just protection, permission. Permission to stop shrinking myself inside my own life. Downstairs, I suddenly heard Sabrina's heels clicking across the hardwood floor, followed by the sharp sound of cabinet doors opening in the kitchen. The house no longer sounded like home. It sounded like someone preparing for ownership. That afternoon, I drove downtown for the first time in nearly 3 months. The city looked different now that winter had settled over everything. Bare trees lined the sidewalks, and people hurried past storefronts carrying paper coffee cups while cold winds swept leaves across the streets. I kept both hands steady on the steering wheel as Richard's letter rested inside my purse beside me. The closer I got to Martin Reeves's office, the calmer I felt. Not because my problems were disappearing, but because uncertainty finally was. Martin's law office occupied the second floor of an old brick building near the courthouse. Richard trusted him for more than 20 years. They played golf together every spring, even though neither of them was particularly good at it. I still remembered the two of them laughing on our back patio after tournaments while Sabrina sat inside scrolling through her phone, pretending to be interested in family conversations. The receptionist greeted me warmly the moment I stepped inside. "Mrs. Carter, it is so good to see you again." Her kindness almost caught me off guard. These days I had become so used to tension inside my own house that basic warmth felt unusual. Martin appeared a minute later carrying a folder beneath one arm. His gray hair had thinned considerably since Richard's funeral, but his voice still carried the same calm steadiness I remembered. "Evelyn," he said gently before shaking my hand with both of his. "Richard would be very glad you came." Something about hearing my husband's name spoken aloud in that office nearly broke me. Martin led me into his private office overlooking the courthouse square where Christmas decorations were already hanging across the street lamps. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I handed him Richard's letter. He read it carefully before removing his glasses with a long, quiet sigh. "I was wondering how long it would take before you found this," he admitted softly. "Richard prepared everything very carefully before he passed." My heartbeat slowed. "Everything?" Martin nodded and opened the thick folder on his desk. Inside were trust documents, property agreements, financial records, and legal papers covered in Richard's familiar signature. "Your husband became concerned during the final year of his illness," Martin explained carefully. "Not about Michael exactly. About influence." He chose that word very deliberately. Influence. Even now, nobody wanted to say Sabrina's name first. Martin slid one document toward me. The house was transferred into a protected family trust 6 months before Richard died. I stared down at the paperwork without fully understanding. "Michael does not own the house." "No," Martin answered calmly. "Neither does Sabrina." A strange silence filled the room after that. Not shock exactly. Relief. The kind that arrives quietly after carrying invisible weight for too long. Martin continued, speaking gently. "Richard created very specific conditions regarding your residency and care. As long as you choose to live in that home, nobody can legally remove you, pressure you to leave, manipulate your finances, or interfere with your access to the property." My fingers tightened around the edge of the chair. He knew this might happen. Martin hesitated before answering. "Richard loved your son deeply, but he also understood human nature, especially when money and property become involved." Outside the office window, snowflakes had started drifting softly through the gray afternoon sky. I watched them gather against parked cars below, while memories surfaced one after another. Sabrina slowly taking over holiday planning after Richard got sick. Michael allowing her to make decisions without consulting me. The missing documents. The realtor. The whispers downstairs at night. It had not started after Richard died. It started when they believed he would. Martin opened another section of the folder. "There is something else." He handed me a separate document marked Amendment Clause. Richard added protections tied to emotional mistreatment and coercion. I looked up slowly. Martin's voice remained professional, but I noticed sadness in his eyes. If it can be demonstrated that someone in the household intentionally attempted to isolate, humiliate, manipulate, or pressure you out of the residence, their inheritance rights can be significantly reduced or revoked entirely. The room became completely silent after that. Even the faint sounds of traffic outside seemed distant now. Suddenly, I understood why Richard wrote that letter. He was not only leaving me protection, he was leaving me leverage. Martin folded his hands carefully across the desk. "Evelyn, I need to ask you something honestly." I met his eyes. "Do you believe they are trying to force you out of your own home?" I thought about Sabrina pointing at me during dinner. Michael lowering his eyes. Chloe whispering that the house would finally feel like theirs if I disappeared. The missing key. The hidden documents. The realtor. The endless small humiliations disguised as practicality. I exhaled slowly and looked down at Richard's signature across the papers. "Yes," I answered quietly. "I think they already decided I am supposed to leave." Martin nodded once, almost like he had expected that answer all along. Then he closed the folder gently and asked the question that changed everything. "Would you like me to intervene now?" he said calmly. "Or would you prefer to wait and see how far they are willing to go?" On the drive home from Martin's office, I did not turn on the radio. I wanted silence. Real silence. Not the strained kind that filled the house lately, where every conversation sounded rehearsed and every smile carried conditions underneath it. Snow drifted softly across the windshield while traffic crawled through downtown intersections glowing with early Christmas lights. For the first time in 2 years, I no longer felt confused about what was happening around me. Painful truths are still truths. And once you finally see them clearly, pretending becomes impossible. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed a white SUV parked near the curb beside the house. A magnetic sign on the door read Coastal Ridge Realty. I sat frozen behind the steering wheel for several seconds staring at it while cold air fogged the edges of the windshield. Sabrina had not wasted any time. Through the front windows, I could see movement inside the living room. I grabbed my purse calmly and walked toward the house, my boots crunching softly. Against thin layers of snow gathering across the stone pathway Richard installed himself years ago. The moment I stepped through the front door, I heard unfamiliar voices near the dining room. Natural light is definitely one of the strongest selling points, a woman was saying brightly. Selling points. I slowly removed my gloves and coat before entering the room. Sabrina stood beside an elegant blonde realtor who held a leather portfolio against her chest, while Michael lingered awkwardly near the fireplace, pretending to study his phone. The moment Sabrina saw me, surprise flashed across her face for half a second before disappearing behind one of her polished smiles. "Oh," she said lightly. "You are home early." Home. Interesting choice of words considering how badly she wanted me gone. The realtor extended her hand politely. "Hi there. Jennifer Walsh." I shook her hand gently. "Evelyn Carter." Jennifer glanced between me and Sabrina with visible uncertainty. Smart woman. She could already sense tension hanging in the air like static electricity before a storm. Sabrina recovered quickly. "Jennifer is just helping us explore future renovation possibilities," she explained casually. "Nothing official yet." Michael remained silent near the fireplace. Again, always silent. Jennifer opened her portfolio and spread several glossy pages across the dining room table. Floor plans, estimated property values, renovation sketches. One image showed Richard's painting studio transformed into a modern guest suite with white furniture and glass shelving. I stared at the page quietly while memories rushed through my mind. Richard standing at his easel in paint-covered jeans. Jazz music drifting through open windows during summer evenings. The smell of turpentine and coffee. His laugh whenever he accidentally got paint on his face. Sabrina touched the photo with manicured fingers. This space has so much potential once it is updated. Potential. Another word people use when they want to erase the past without sounding cruel. Richard built that studio himself, I said calmly. Jennifer immediately looked uncomfortable. Sabrina folded her arms lightly. "Well, people have to move forward eventually." There was no anger in her voice. That was what made it colder. She spoke about my husband the same way people discuss outdated wallpaper. Michael finally looked up then. "Maybe we should talk about this later," he muttered quietly. Sabrina ignored him completely. Jennifer also thinks opening the downstairs floor plan could increase value significantly. Increase value. Every sentence now sounded like preparation. Like they were already redesigning a life that still included me physically, but no longer emotionally. Chloe appeared in the hallway then, still wearing her school sweatshirt. The second she saw the realtor and the papers spread across the table, confusion crossed her face. "What is going on?" she asked softly. Sabrina answered too quickly. "Nothing you need to worry about." But Chloe kept staring at the renovation images until her eyes landed on the studio sketch. "You are changing Grandpa's studio?" she whispered. Nobody answered immediately. That silence said enough. Chloe looked heartbroken in a way only children can look when they realize adults are destroying something sacred while pretending it is practical. Jennifer cleared her throat awkwardly and began gathering her papers. "Perhaps this is not the best time," she said gently. Smart woman again. She understood she had accidentally walked into a family fracture nobody wanted spoken aloud. Sabrina escorted her toward the front door while Michael rubbed one hand across his forehead without saying a word. I watched my son carefully then. Really watched him. He looked exhausted. Older somehow. Like living beside Sabrina required constant surrender disguised as compromise. After the realtor left, Sabrina returned to the dining room and straightened the stack of renovation sketches neatly against the table. "You could have at least warned me before bringing strangers into my home," I said quietly. The room fell completely still after those words. My home. Not our home. Not Michael's house. Mine. Sabrina's expression tightened almost invisibly. Michael looked up sharply for the first time all afternoon. Then Sabrina smiled again. Small. Controlled. Dangerous. Well, she replied, softly while sliding the renovation sketches back into their folder, that depends on whose home this really is. After that conversation in the dining room, something inside the house shifted completely. The pretending stopped. Nobody said it out loud, but we all felt it. Sabrina no longer bothered hiding her irritation whenever I entered a room. Michael avoided eye contact almost constantly now, like looking directly at me forced him to confront the kind of son he had become. Even the air inside the house felt heavier, strained beneath layers of unspoken resentment and quiet calculations. 2 days later, I woke early and walked downstairs to make tea before sunrise. The kitchen lights were already on. Sabrina sat at the island counter in silk workout clothes scrolling through a furniture catalog while drinking green juice from a tall glass bottle. She glanced up briefly when I entered, but said nothing. I filled the kettle quietly and stood near the stove listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator. Then I noticed several cardboard boxes stacked near the back hallway leading toward the garage. My name was written across the side of one box in black marker. Evelyn. Winter clothes. Another box read old photos. I stared at them for several long seconds before speaking. What are those? Sabrina turned another page in her catalog without urgency. Just trying to organize things early. Organize. Such an innocent word. The upstairs storage room is overflowing, she continued calmly. I figured we should start sorting through items nobody really uses anymore. Nobody really uses anymore. I looked at the boxes again. Inside one sat Richard's old record player wrapped carefully in newspaper. Beside it was the ceramic Christmas village I collected for nearly 30 years. Every item represented pieces of a life Sabrina considered clutter. You went into my room? I asked quietly. Sabrina finally looked up then, her expression cool and almost amused. This is a shared house, Evelyn. Nobody is invading your privacy. Shared house. Interesting how quickly language changes when people want ownership. The kettle whistled softly behind me, but I suddenly no longer wanted tea. Upstairs, footsteps crossed the hallway ceiling above us. Michael getting ready for work. Right on schedule. Sabrina closed the catalog and folded her hands neatly together. Honestly, I think this transition would be easier if everyone stopped treating practical decisions like emotional attacks. I almost smiled at that. There is something remarkable about people who wound others while insisting they are simply being practical. Practical, I repeated softly. Like turning Richard's studio into a guest suite before his paintbrushes are even cold. Her jaw tightened slightly. A small crack in the perfect composure. Richard is gone, she said flatly. The rest of us still have lives to live. The words echoed through the kitchen with startling emptiness. Not cruelty fueled by anger. Worse, cruelty fueled by convenience. Michael entered the kitchen moments later adjusting his watch while carrying his laptop bag. He immediately sensed tension but looked exhausted before either of us spoke. Morning, he muttered quietly. Sabrina stood and kissed his cheek. I was just explaining to your mother that we should probably begin clearing some of the upstairs storage. Michael glanced toward the boxes near the hallway. His face changed instantly. Guilt. Embarrassment. Weakness. Sabrina, he said under his breath. Maybe we should wait. For what? She replied sharply. Nothing changes because people avoid uncomfortable conversations. Then she turned toward me again. You said yourself last week that stairs are becoming harder for you. I stared at her carefully. No, I answered calmly. I said my knee hurts sometimes when it rains. Michael rubbed his forehead slowly. Can we please not do this right now? There it was again. Not defense. Not support. Just exhaustion. My son had spent so much time avoiding conflict that he no longer understood neutrality becomes betrayal eventually. Chloe entered the kitchen, then wearing fuzzy socks and carrying her backpack. The second she noticed the boxes, her expression dropped. Why are Grandma's things packed? Nobody answered immediately. Sabrina grabbed her car keys from the counter. Nobody is packing anyone, she said. Quickly. We are just organizing. Chloe walked directly toward the boxes anyway. She pulled back the newspaper covering Richard's record player and looked heartbroken. Grandpa loved this, she whispered. Sabrina exhaled impatiently. Chloe, do not start. But Chloe ignored her completely. She looked at me instead. Grandma, are they making you leave? The room became painfully silent. Michael opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Sabrina crossed her arms defensively. And suddenly I understood something very clearly. Children always recognize truth faster than adults do because they have not yet learned how to disguise selfishness as practicality. I walked calmly toward the boxes and rested my hand gently on the top one marked with my name. Then I looked directly at Sabrina for the first time in days without lowering my eyes. "Nobody is making me leave," I said softly. "Not this house." Sabrina held my gaze for several seconds. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, the confidence faded from her expression for the very first time. That evening, the house felt unnaturally quiet after Michael and Sabrina retreated upstairs earlier than usual. The tension from breakfast still lingered in every room like smoke after a fire. I sat alone in the living room beside the Christmas tree Richard and I used to decorate together every Thanksgiving weekend without fail. Half the ornaments were still missing because Sabrina preferred what she called a cleaner aesthetic now. She had replaced many of our handmade decorations with white ribbon and silver glass ornaments that looked beautiful but empty. The old angel topper Richard bought during our first year of marriage no longer sat at the top of the tree. I found it packed away in a hallway closet last month, wrapped in newspaper beside several family photo albums. Chloe padded quietly downstairs around 9, carrying a blanket around her shoulders. "Can I sit with you?" she asked softly. "Always," I answered. She curled beside me on the couch while snow drifted outside the windows in slow, steady waves beneath the porch lights. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. The television remained off. Only the soft glow from the tree filled the room. "Dad has not been himself lately," Chloe finally whispered. I looked at her carefully. "Your father is confused." She shook her head slightly. "No, he is scared. Children notice more than adults realize." I rested my hand gently over hers. "Why do you think that?" Chloe stared toward the staircase before answering. "Last night Mom said once everything is finalized, this house will finally belong to them." My expression remained calm, but my chest tightened again. Finalized. Such a dangerous word hidden beneath ordinary conversation. Chloe lowered her voice even further. "Dad asked her if they were moving too fast." I waited quietly. "And Mom said if they waited any longer, you might change things." "Change things." I thought immediately about Richard's trust documents resting safely inside the locked drawer of my nightstand upstairs. Sabrina did not know what Richard had prepared before he died. But somehow, instinctively, she sensed something still stood in her way. The grandfather clock chimed softly across the room. Upstairs, faint footsteps crossed the hallway overhead. Chloe leaned closer beside me. "Grandma," she whispered nervously, "are they really trying to take the house from you?" I looked at the Christmas tree lights reflecting softly across the dark windows. 27 years of birthdays, family dinners, snowstorms, school mornings, anniversary dances in the kitchen while old jazz records played late at night. Every memory inside these walls carried Richard's fingerprints somewhere. "People do strange things when they start thinking about ownership," I answered quietly. Chloe frowned. "But Grandpa built this house with you." "Yes," I said softly. "He did." A long silence settled between us again. Then suddenly the front door alarm beeped softly. Michael stepped inside carrying snow across the hardwood floor while loosening his tie with one hand. He looked exhausted. Older than 70-year-old men sometimes look after difficult winters. The moment he saw Chloe sitting beside me, relief crossed his face briefly. "Hey, kiddo," he said quietly. Chloe stood slowly. "I should finish my homework." She kissed my cheek before heading upstairs, but not before glancing back at her father with disappointment, far too heavy for a 14-year-old girl to carry. Michael watched her disappear upstairs before sitting carefully in Richard's old armchair across from me. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The silence between mothers and sons is different from any other silence in the world. It carries history inside it. Childhood fevers, little league games, first heartbreaks, decades of loving someone before they fully become themselves. Michael rubbed his hands together slowly. "Things have been tense lately," he muttered. I almost smiled at the understatement. "Yes," I answered calmly. He leaned forward slightly. "Sabrina feels like everybody blames her." There it was. Not concern for me. Concern for comfort. "Does she?" I asked softly. Michael exhaled heavily and stared toward the fireplace. "She just wants stability." Stability. Another beautiful word people use when they mean control. I studied my son carefully then. The same blue eyes Richard had. The same nervous habit of tapping his thumb against his palm whenever stress overwhelmed him. He looked trapped inside decisions he no longer knew how to defend. Do you remember what your father always said about this house? I asked quietly. Michael's expression shifted instantly. Of course he remembered. Richard repeated it every Christmas Eve after dinner while standing beside the tree with bourbon in one hand. A home only stays warm if people inside it protect each other, Michael answered softly. My throat tightened hearing him say it aloud. Because somewhere along the way, my son forgot. Upstairs, I heard Sabrina's heels moving across the hallway floor again. Waiting. Listening perhaps. Michael stood slowly from the chair. I do not want this family falling apart, he admitted quietly before heading toward the staircase. I watched him stop halfway up. For one brief second, he almost turned back toward me like the little boy who once ran into my arms after nightmares. But then he kept walking upstairs toward his wife instead. And in that moment, I realized something painful but freeing at the same time. Michael was no longer deciding between peace and conflict. He was deciding between truth and comfort. And so far, comfort was winning. 3 nights later, I invited everyone to dinner. Not because I wanted peace anymore. Peace had already left this house months ago. I invited them because some truths deserve witnesses when they finally step into the light. Sabrina seemed strangely cheerful all afternoon while setting the dining room table with her expensive holiday plates and silver candle holders. She wore a cream-colored sweater dress and diamond earrings Richard once gave me for our 30th anniversary before she somehow convinced Michael they suited her better. Funny how certain people slowly collect pieces of your life while pretending they're simply borrowing them. Michael looked nervous from the moment he came home from work. He kept checking his phone and asking unnecessary questions about dinner like a man sensing a storm without understanding where it would strike. Chloe stayed unusually quiet during the meal preparation, though I caught her watching Sabrina several times with guarded eyes no child her age should have. By 6:30, the dining room glowed beneath candlelight while snow fell steadily outside the windows. The same dining room where Sabrina pointed at me days earlier like I was an inconvenience standing in the way of her future. Tonight, however, something felt different. Not louder, calmer. The kind of calm that arrives right before a long, overdue truth finally speaks. Sabrina poured wine for herself and Michael before taking her seat. This looks lovely, she said brightly while adjusting her napkin. It feels nice having everyone together again. I almost admired the performance. Michael glanced toward me uncertainly. Mom said she wanted tonight to be special, he added quietly. I do, I answered. Dinner began politely enough. Small talk about Chloe's school orchestra concert. Snow forecasts. Holiday traffic downtown. Sabrina carried most conversations herself, while Michael nodded absently beside her. Every few minutes, she smiled at me with artificial warmth that no longer fooled anyone at the table. Halfway through dinner, the doorbell rang. Sabrina frowned. Immediately. Are we expecting someone? She asked. Yes, I answered calmly before setting my fork beside my plate. Michael looked confused as I stood and walked toward the front hallway. When I returned moments later, Martin Reeves entered the dining room, carrying a dark leather briefcase beneath one arm. The atmosphere changed instantly. Sabrina's smile disappeared so fast, it almost looked painful. Michael straightened in his chair. Martin, he asked nervously. What is going on? Martin greeted everyone politely before taking the empty seat beside me. Good evening. Sabrina forced a small laugh. This feels very formal suddenly. Nobody answered her. Martin opened his briefcase carefully and removed several folders stacked neatly inside. The sound of paper against what seemed unnaturally loud inside the silent room. Michael stared at me with growing concern. Mom. I folded my hands calmly in my lap. I asked Martin to join us because there are a few misunderstandings about this house that need clarification. Sabrina's entire posture stiffened instantly. What misunderstandings? Martin slid several legal documents across the table toward Michael first. Your father established a protected family trust before his death, he explained professionally. The Carter residence legally remains under Mrs. Carter's control for the duration of her lifetime. Michael blinked several times while reading the first page. Color slowly drained from his face. Sabrina leaned over quickly, trying to read the documents herself. What does that mean? She demanded sharply. Martin's expression never changed. It means Mrs. Carter cannot be removed, pressured to relocate, financially manipulated, or denied peaceful access to any part of the property. Silence crashed across the dining room. Even the ticking grandfather clock from the hallway suddenly sounded louder. Sabrina looked directly at me now, with disbelief hardening into panic. "Michael," she whispered harshly, "tell me this is not real." But Michael was still staring down at the paperwork with trembling hands. Martin opened another folder calmly. "There is also an enforcement clause tied specifically to emotional coercion and intimidation." Sabrina froze completely. "What?" Martin adjusted his glasses slightly. "Any documented attempts to isolate, humiliate, pressure, or emotionally force Mrs. Carter from the residence could result in immediate revocation of inheritance privileges connected to the trust." Chloe looked between everyone wide-eyed while Michael's breathing visibly changed beside her. "Inheritance revoked?" he whispered. Martin nodded once. "Completely." Sabrina pushed her chair back suddenly. "This is insane." For the first time since Richard died, her polished composure cracked completely. "We were trying to improve the house. We were helping her." Nobody spoke, because everyone at that table knew the truth now. Sabrina turned toward Michael desperately. "Say something." But my son only stared at me, with shattered realization spreading slowly across his face. He finally understood his father saw this coming long before any of us did. Tears gathered in Michael's eyes unexpectedly. "Dad knew," he whispered softly. I looked at my son calmly across the candlelit table. "Your father understood people better than either of us wanted to admit." Sabrina grabbed the edge of the table tightly. "So what now?" she snapped bitterly. I held her gaze steadily for several long seconds before answering. "Now," I said quietly, "this house belongs to the people who still remember how to treat family."